They didn't expect him to speak English. They didn't expect him to speak with fire. But what they never expected was that a 35-year-old African soldier would walk into Geneva and challenge the world's most powerful legal minds in front of live television cameras. The room was dressed in suits and silence. He stood in boots and burden. Behind him, the voices of 21 million Burkina souls. Before him, decades of treaties signed in shadows. Across the hall sat Judge Edward Chen, the legal titan whose pen had overturned presidents and whose words could silence nations. What unfolded next wasn't just diplomacy. It wasn't even debate. It was a reckoning. The courtroom was now Africa's battlefield, and the question he raised still hangs over us all. What law protects our children when corporations poison their water with Western contracts? It's the future our ancestors were chained for, whipped for, died for, and still believed in. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that will never bow again. The Geneva International Convention Center wasn't just a building that morning, it was history holding its breath. Delegates from 150 nations pace through the marble corridors, their polished shoes clicking like distant gunfire across the halls that had once welcomed kings and crushed nations. Outside, Swiss rain whispered against the glass, but inside, every breath felt like a drumbeat counting down to confrontation. Camera crews adjusted their lenses, hunting for angles of power. Translators flicked on headsets. The scent of coffee mingled with fear. This wasn't just another global summit. This was the day Africa would speak for herself. At the center of it all, he sat. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. His boots were dusty. His uniform was plain. But his presence? Immense. In a sea of tailored suits and silk ties, this 35-year-old soldier from Burkina Faso looked like a man who'd walked out of history and into Judgment Day. Calloused hands, focused eyes, shoulders bearing not only the weight of a nation, but of a continent. He didn't come for applause. He didn't come to plead. He came because silence was no longer an option. Behind him, his small delegation sat whispering in Moor and French, language of the ancestors and language of the colonizer. Folded in his jacket pocket were letters from farmers, mothers, miners, whose land had been taken, whose children had died, whose futures had been sold to foreign companies in contracts written in another tongue. He came to speak for them, and nothing, not law, not power, not protocol, would stop him. But across the chamber, watching through steel-rimmed glasses, sat another man, Judge Edward Chen, born in Oakland, raised in courts, built by fire. His parents had fled Taiwan to escape persecution. They worked nights, folded dreams into laundry, and taught their boy that justice mattered more than comfort. At 12, Edward was reciting constitutional law at the kitchen table. At 22, he was graduating from Harvard Law with honors and a fury for fairness. But make no mistake, he was no idealist. He was a surgeon. His blade was law. His theater was the courtroom. Appointed to the federal bench in his early 30s, Chen became known for rulings that dismantled corporations and exposed federal overreach. Liberals called him bold. Conservatives called him dangerous. The world called him sharp. And now, as a judicial advisor to the UN Human Rights Council, he'd asked to personally respond to any challenge to international legal order. He wasn't here for show. He was here to defend the rules of the world, no matter who questioned them. Two men, two histories, two visions of justice, one room, and the whole world watching. The moment came without announcement, only the hush that fell like a curtain. The chamber, darkened by unspoken tension, brightened beneath the spotlight as a placard was placed. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. 4 languages. One message. The young leader rose slowly, every movement deliberate, as if he knew that the world would remember not just his words, but how he stood when he said them. His boots struck the floor like a verdict. His jacket still creased from his flight. His face unreadable, but his eyes burning. He stepped to the podium like a soldier to the front line. Behind the glass, cameras captured every angle. In the press gallery, seasoned journalists leaned forward, pens frozen, breath held. And then, silence. 10 full seconds. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew the weight of what was about to be said. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't through translators. It was in English. Crisp, clear, deliberate. Honorable delegates, distinguished guests. He didn't shout. He didn't stumble. He didn't flatter. He spoke like a man on trial, but not for himself. For his people. For their soil. For their stolen gold and vanished futures. His speech began as a quiet wind. But it rose, with purpose. He spoke of contracts signed in Paris that never saw a village in Burkina Faso, of gold taken by French corporations, $2 billion a year, while his own people couldn't afford a shirt made from the cotton they grew. He spoke of children drinking poisoned water, of farmers exiled from their ancestral land so a mining firm could dig deeper. He read names. He cited figures. He listed violations. But most of all, he asked one question. Whose law protects African children? When corporations poison our rivers and call it progress, a shiver moved through the chamber. Delegates rustled papers. The French shifted uncomfortably, and across the room, Judge Edward Chen stopped writing. The silence was no longer respectful, it was stunned. Because Traore didn't sound like a dictator. He sounded like a mirror, one held up to the world's hypocrisy. From his jacket, he pulled a document. Not grand, not printed, folded, handwritten. This, he said, is the contract signed with a French mining company. 99 years. For uranium, at 5% market value. He let the numbers speak. He let the silence do the rest. And then, in a voice steadier than stone, Burkina Faso will no longer honor contracts signed in shadows, without the consent of our people. He didn't consult, he declared. A bomb of words detonated in that chamber. Whispers, frantic texting. Delegates calling aides, the CNN journalist typing furiously. European faces turned pale. African delegates straightened up, some in pride, others in fear. And somewhere in the back, a quiet voice whispered what everyone was thinking. Did he just declare economic war on the West? Because in those few sentences, Traore had done what coups, protests, and decades of negotiation had failed to do. He had stood before the architects of global law and called them thieves. He had accused the international order of dressing exploitation in the language of justice. And he had done it not with guns, but with truth. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, must say Amen in the comments below. As Traore stepped back from the podium, the room didn't clap. It inhaled. It trembled. It calculated. Because everyone knew what came next. Judge Edward Chen stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise his hand. But the room stood still, like a congregation before a sermon. He walked toward the microphone with the slow, deliberate grace of a man about to perform surgery. Black robes flowing, eyes sharp as razors. And when he spoke, his voice had the cold weight of a verdict already written. Captain Traore, that first word landed like a slap. Not president, not your excellency, just captain. The room caught the insult. So did Traore. His jaw tensed, but Chen didn't pause. International law, he continued, exists to prevent strong men from tearing up contracts when they become inconvenient. His tone wasn't angry. It was surgical, clean, cold. Each word slicing Traore's arguments into legal fragments. He reminded the chamber and the cameras that law outlives governments, that sovereignty must honor contracts, that without legal order, chaos rules. The French delegates nodded. The World Bank officials exhaled. African representatives? They stared down, torn between their pride and the paperwork. And then came the line, the one that would echo across continents. Chen removed his glasses, looked Traore in the eye, and said, "The road to tyranny, Captain, is always paved with good intentions, and the bodies of contracts that inconvenience the powerful." Silence, then whispers, then chaos. The press gallery lit up. Social media ignited. Judge Chen destroys Traore blazed across CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. And in that moment, Geneva didn't feel like a summit. It felt like a battlefield, and the gavel had become a weapon. Because Chen hadn't just defended law, he had cornered Traore, made him look reckless, dangerous, dictatorial. And that was the genius of it. With one sentence, Chen had framed African sovereignty as threat, not justice. And no amount of passion could undo the power of that logic in a hall full of lawyers and diplomats. The French delegation smiled. The American reps took notes. And African Union leaders. They sat in quiet horror, watching their champion's legitimacy vanish under the weight of precedent. Traore didn't flinch. He stood, silent, staring. But in his silence, even his allies feared. Had he gone too far? Because that's how empires fight now. Not with bullets, but with clauses. Not with armies, but with contracts. Not with conquest, but with courtrooms. And in that moment, the message was clear. Captain Ibrahim latest news. He'd just been legally executed in public. For 15 seconds, the room held its breath. Not out of respect, but disbelief. Judge Chen had just dismantled years of revolutionary momentum with a single polished sentence. And then, Traore raised his hand. Not in surrender, but in defiance. His voice was low, controlled, but it pierced like thunder in a cathedral. Your Honor. The title hung in the air, both respectful and ironic. You speak of law with the precision of a man who has never watched children drink poisoned water. A ripple passed through the room. The insult wasn't loud, but it hit deep, because it didn't attack Chen's logic. It attacked the distance of that logic. Traore kept speaking calmly, but his words carried a new energy. He didn't challenge the law, he exposed it. The same international law you defend once legalized slavery, justified colonial occupation, and declared entire continents empty, until Europe arrived. A shift in the chamber. European faces tightened, African heads lifted. Because now, Traore wasn't just a rebel. He was a historian, and his target wasn't Chen anymore. It was the system. So forgive me, he continued, if I choose the screams of dying children over the sanctity of contracts signed in Geneva by men who sold our future for Swiss bank accounts. Boom. No yelling. No rage. Just surgical morality. This time Chen didn't respond. He listened. The CNN correspondent updated her feed. Traore fights back, reframes law as instrument of oppression. In the press gallery, silence fell again, but not the kind Chen had commanded. This silence was different. It was uncomfortable. It was reflective. Because Traore had just exposed the moral hypocrisy of the very frameworks being used to silence him. And the question now wasn't whether he was right, but why the system had no answer. His speech hadn't undone Chen's logic. It had lifted the curtain on it, and what lay behind? Centuries of elegant oppression, legal systems that made colonial theft sound like order, constitutions that protected contracts more than communities, trade laws that guaranteed poverty, wrapped in diplomacy. This wasn't a coup in military terms. It was a coup in consciousness. And in that moment, African delegates found their voice again. Not in slogans, but in silence that said, he's right. Because no nation ever signed a contract to be poor. No farmer ever agreed to give away uranium for pennies. No child ever voted to drink lead instead of water. But all of those things were legal. And Traore had just asked the question that shook every marble pillar in Geneva. If the law protects injustice, what then protects the people? Burkina Faso latest news. Their president just turned the world's courtroom into Africa's classroom. The hashtag exploded before the session even ended. New contracts of these children. What started as a moral rebuttal became a global debate. Harvard Law added it to their syllabus. Oxford professors called it the reckoning of Western jurisprudence. And across Africa, it wasn't just a trending topic. It was a wake-up call. Traore's words lit fires from Ouagadougou to Lagos. Mali, Guinea, and even Nigeria began reviewing their mining contracts. University students quoted him in campus protests. Civil society leaders in Senegal and Ghana cited his Geneva speech to demand transparency from European NGOs. Meanwhile, back in Geneva, the room hadn't recovered. Judge Chen remained composed, but even he paused, because Traore hadn't broken the law. He had recentered the law around people. And for the first time in decades, international diplomats had to face a question they were trained to avoid. Can legal brilliance justify historical injustice? That wasn't a courtroom debate. It was a spiritual one. The press tried to frame it as East versus West, youth versus wisdom, passion versus protocol. But deep down, every African watching knew exactly what it was. A young son of the soil daring to tell the empire, no more. His line would echo louder than any ruling. Our children do not drink contracts. They drink the water you poisoned. The legal world squirmed. Because there was no doctrine for that. No article. No clause. No precedent that could make that statement disappear. And even as Chen's logic remained unshaken, his heart had shifted. In his future court decisions, subtle traces of that Geneva moment would surface. He would still uphold the Constitution, but now he'd ask, whom does this protect? And whom does it silence? And that too was a victory, not for Traore the man, but for Africa the idea. An Africa no longer asking for permission. An Africa no longer defending its pain in someone else's language. An Africa no longer accepting the contract as gospel when the ink was mixed with blood. Because this confrontation wasn't about one leader or one clause or one courtroom. It was about legacy, about the quiet roar of millions of Africans who have never seen a contract but live its consequences daily. It was about the farmer who buries his child after mining chemicals infect the well. The mother who sells her last grain of millet to pay a tax she never agreed to. The teenager who learns that his country is rich, but his school has no books. Traore brought them all into that room. He didn't win a debate. He rebuilt the argument. And when he left Geneva, he didn't carry applause. He carried letters. He carried stares. He carried proof that a new Africa had spoken. And this time, it wasn't asking. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say Amen in the comments below. As Traore stepped away from the podium, the silence was deafening. Not because people didn't know what to say, but because for the first time, they were really listening. Judge Chen remained seated, his hands folded neatly before him. His expression unreadable, but his stillness spoke volumes. Around the chamber, something intangible had shifted. The legal arguments were still on the table. The contracts, the precedents, the treaties, still valid, still binding. But the room had heard something else. They'd heard the weight of history. The quiet anguish of a continent that had signed nothing, yet paid for everything. And it wasn't just Geneva that paused. In Abuja, mothers watched the clip and nodded quietly. In Bamako, students replayed the confrontation and whispered, "We're not crazy." Even in Paris, officials adjusted their language, partnership instead of aid, respect instead of reform. Because something had cracked. Not the system, not yet, but its confidence. Judge Chen had spoken with mastery, but Traore had spoken with memory. And that difference, between law and life, between contracts and consequences, left a scar the legal world couldn't quite bandage. As the camera faded to black, one image remained. A young African president standing alone at the podium, hands steady, eyes clear, his silence louder than anything he had just said. It was not the end of the story. It was the breath before the verdict. In the days that followed, headlines circled the globe. Judge destroys African leader with one sentence. Africa's youth fires back, and the world listens. But long after the headlines faded, the echoes remained. Because Geneva wasn't just a diplomatic clash. It was the collision of two worlds, one ruled by precedent, the other moved by pain. And when the dust settled, something remarkable had happened. For the first time in decades, African sovereignty wasn't dismissed as radicalism. It was respected as resistance. Across the continent, leaders began renegotiating colonial-era contracts. Civil movements grew bolder, and young lawyers from Lagos to Lusaka enrolled in law school, not to serve the system, but to redefine it. Judge Chen returned to San Francisco, still brilliant, still respected, but changed. He began asking different questions in his courtroom. Not just what is legal, but what is just. Not just what is written, but who gets to write it. As for Captain Ibrahim, he walked out of Geneva not as a defeated man, but as a dangerous idea. The kind of idea that no law, no courtroom, no empire can contain. That Africans are not bound by papers signed in their absence. That dignity isn't negotiable, and that the law, if it is to survive, must serve the people, not enslave them. Captain Ibrahim latest news? He gave voice to the voiceless, and now they echo louder than ever. Burkina Faso latest news? They're not asking to be free anymore. They're acting like it. If this story moves something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. Comment of the day, Africa Rise.